Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining this panel discussion this morning on the fragile ceasefire in Idlib and the Syrian conflict. We have a distinguished panel of experts. I'll introduce them briefly. Apologies for the kind of 10-minute late start because we had some technical issues. Hopefully, we are able to now live stream it. As many of you know, since last fall, 2018, there has been a ceasefire that has never been really fully implemented, but nevertheless, there was a lot of decrease in violence in Idlib area through the agreement between Russia and Turkey for a deconfliction zone and a demilitarized buffer zone as part of it. And at the time, US President Trump had sent a message of support as well, warning Russia and regime not to cause a humanitarian disaster in Idlib. But recently, as you know, especially this month in May, the regime has started operations in Idlib with the support of Russia. There are reports more than 270 civilians have been killed, and the fighting is ongoing currently. There are different debates, obviously, whether this is going to turn into a big operation by the regime, and how soon they can get the sort of achieve their objectives in Idlib, if at all. And then we have the combination of various factions on the ground, various opposition groups fighting the regime, and of course the whole geopolitical game that's being played by the sort of big and regional powers over Syria is playing out to a large extent in Idlib as well. And the outcome of this conflict, particularly in Idlib, will have implications for the eventual sort of resolution, if you can call it that, of the conflict. And the U.S. has just recently talked about reviving 2012 Geneva plan with Russia as well. So a lot is going on. We'll start with Idlib, but we do want to discuss the broader issues, but we want to start small and focused, outlining what's happening in Idlib and why it matters. I want to thank my colleagues and distinguished panel of experts. Just to my left, Charles Lister is a senior fellow and director of counterterrorism and extremism program at the Middle East Institute. Thank you, Charles. To his left, we have Bassam Barabandi. He's a co-founder and director of external relations at People Demand Change. Just to his left, Jeff Aronson is chairman and co-founder of the Mortons Group. He's a consultant with that company, but he's also written a lot about Syria, Israel, the regional issues for many, many years. And just to his left, Daniel Server, Professor Server, is a director of conflict management at SAIS at Johns Hopkins University. I want to welcome you all, and I'll turn to Charles to tell us about, particularly in Idlib, what's happening in Idlib. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. It's sad to be here talking about Idlib. I think what's going on there is horrendous these days, but as someone who's been working in the weeds of Idlib's complexity for the last 8 years, describing the dynamics on the ground, which I think is my challenge for the next 5 minutes, is a challenge. But I'll give it a go. I think the situation we're seeing now, which I hope many of you have seen already on the news and elsewhere, has been coming for a long time. I think the way you set it out, the establishment of de-escalation zones, the subsequent establishment of a DMZ, all of that was, I think, as far as I was concerned from the very beginning, a stopgap for an inevitable confrontation in northwestern Syria. The fact that the northwest was the area, the only area of Syria where all defeated and surrendered insurgents were evacuated to in order to fight the last fight, made what we're seeing now, again, as I say, inevitable. But the stakes really couldn't be much higher. Idlib only amounts to about 3 or 4% of Syria's territory, and yet it holds at least 3 million people today. A huge proportion of Syria's remaining population is crammed in Idlib. All of the IDP camps are full or over capacity. So there are a great many IDPs, including nearly 200,000 that have been displaced in the last few weeks, who have now no option but to camp out in fields because there is literally nowhere else for people to flee to. And of course, the border with Turkey is shut. Idlib used to have a provincial population of around 750,000. So again, to put it in context, it's gone up nearly fourfold over the last 8 years. And as a result of this quite purposeful regime strategy of making Idlib the dumping ground for defeated fighters and for extremists, and eventually this kind of last stand. Turkey obviously has a key role to play, sharing the border with Idlib and the surrounding region. Having taken in 3.5 million Syrian refugees over the last 8 years, the border is shut to any other IDPs considering trying to cross the border. That is also problematic. And amidst the chaos of the last few weeks, there have been a great many Syrians who have made public statements and public interviews to the media saying if things do get worse, they will start running for the border. And honestly, looking at how bad things have got just over the last week, I wouldn't be surprised if we do start to see that. That would be a big challenge to Turkey to know how to respond to that challenge. Internally in Idlib, it's immensely complicated. I mean, notwithstanding the 3 million plus civilians, the armed group dynamics are very complex. The most dominant organization in northwestern Syria is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the at least former official al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, probably numbers around 15 to 20,000 full-time fighters now in Idlib. They are the dominant actor, but they don't, by de facto, control the northwest of Syria. In fact, they're deeply unpopular within the civilian population. Happy to explain why, but we don't have the time in the next couple minutes. But they're deeply unpopular, but they do have an overarching influence over the dynamics of that region. Al-Qaeda loyalists number probably around 5,000, distributed primarily within the core of Idlib and also in the northwestern area, in the northwestern pocket. And then on top of that, there's probably 20 to 25,000 what I would call mainstream opposition fighters, many groups who traditionally have branded themselves with the Free Syrian Army label, other groups who have insisted for a while on maintaining a more independent status. But the dynamics between all of those actors is immensely complicated. For periods of time, they've all fought each other. For periods of time, they've all been in alliances. For now, with the impending assault or with the ongoing assault, they have more or less united their operations in defense. How long they can continue to maintain that unity is another question, and certainly something I think Russia wants to try and exploit. And as to why we are where we are right now, back in February, I spoke to a number of Russian officials who said, having just come back from an Astana meeting, that an offensive on Idlib was then imminent. They'd agreed with Turkey that it was going to be a limited operation, that was the word, a limited operation aimed at reinforcing the demilitarized zone, not recapturing vast swathes of territory, but weakening the opposition, sending a message and reinforcing the DMZ. And I think for the first week or two of the offensive, which began more or less in early April, that's basically what we saw. And I think that in and of itself is significant. Another significant element here is the fact that Iran, from the very beginning of those discussions in February, made it very clear it would play no role in offensive operations in northwestern Syria. According to the Russians I spoke to, they were willing to play a support role, potentially in artillery and standoff operations, but they weren't willing essentially to shed blood fighting for an area that for Iran is of little strategic consequence. And I think that's an important dynamic for us to consider here in the US as we look at Russian-Iranian relations, the dynamics there vis-a-vis Damascus, et cetera, et cetera. A couple other comments. Beyond the fact that we saw for a week or two what we expected to see, or I expected to see, this limited offensive, I think what was somewhat unexpected was the extent to which the armed groups, by this time united under one objective, defense, the extent to which they successfully stood a line. After the first kind of 10 days of shock, the lines pretty much remained still. There were two areas of operations. We don't have a map right now, but there were two areas of offensive operations for the regime. One was in northern Hama, which was at the bottom end of this northwestern zone, and one was in eastern Latakia, which is in the top left-hand corner. In the south, there were 2 towns and a handful of villages were captured in a couple of weeks. In the northeast, they didn't move an inch. The regime failed every single day to move an inch. In fact, they got routed every single time they tried to push forward. So what was unexpected was the extent to which the regime actually, I think, struggled to send the extent of the message that they would have wanted to, even by calling this a limited operation. And to further reinforce that point, the opposition then launched a counterattack and retook one of the 2 towns, the only 2 towns captured, and the biggest of the 2, which they held for 2 or 3 days before losing again. But the message sent again was that retaking all of northwestern Syria, if ever that is an objective, is going to be a hell of a challenge. The regime has put all of its most loyalist and most capable units on the front line of this operation. And yet, even with the weight of the Russian and Syrian Air Force, frankly, they have struggled to make a significant amount of progress, which I think explains why we've seen this shock and awe carpet bombing campaign over the last couple of weeks, as both a punishment but also a message from Russia that this is, as far as Russia is concerned, the only way that the conflict in the northwest is going to end, through shock and awe and what they call reconciliation, what most of us would call a surrender of the opposition. Frankly, I don't think we're going to see that happen in the northwest like we saw it elsewhere in Syria. But that's the message Russia is sending by destroying 25 schools and over 50 medical facilities over the last month, most of them in targeted strikes, as has been well documented in the media. So the last thing I would say on this is, well, where are we now? So as of yesterday, at least as far as I was told, the UN was mediating Turkish-Russian negotiations for a ceasefire. A couple of people told me last night it's possible that ceasefire might be announced today. I'm still somewhat skeptical, but we'll wait and see. But a ceasefire is a ceasefire. It's not a permanent end to conflict in northwestern Syria. The cat has been let out the bag. The regime has finally seen that it is possible, as successfully or not, to launch offensive operations in northwestern Syria. Turkey has been shown to be somewhat vulnerable in terms of preventing that from happening. The DMZ didn't work. De-escalation didn't work on Turkey's end or from the regime's end. As far as the regime is concerned, it will be retaking this territory one day. And I think the fact that the cat has been let out the bag is a concerning sign for the future. Ceasefires are good, but they're not going to stop the threat of this happening repeatedly and repeatedly and repeatedly until who knows what happens at the end.
Just to clarify, you mentioned that the Russians were saying this was going to be a reinforcement of DMZ. By the kind of how it's going, do you think they're sticking to that, or it's a broader?
Well, I think it's certainly become broader. I mean, if you speak to people on the ground, a lot of the major airstrikes that have been conducted over the last week or so have been in what they call the northern section of the de-escalation zone, far away from the DMZ, in the interior of Idlib, which doesn't fit at all with a reinforce the DMZ objective, which is why I think Russia is trying to send this message. Like, if you resist, if Turkey resists, by the way, Turkey did send in new supplies of military equipment, and allegedly, according to Reuters, some number of American anti-tank missiles left over from the anti-regime program that closed a couple of years ago. The message is also to Turkey: if you resist these limited operations, this is the consequence. And so we're effectively seeing a standoff. Okay. Who blinks first is one element of that standoff. And the other one, as I say, is the cat has been let out the bag. We've all known the regime wanted this all along. The Russians were restraining them, and undoubtedly, because Russia, I think, knows how challenging it will be to retake northwestern Syria. But it's going to be very hard to pull the regime back now that they have tasted what this battle is like.
Okay. Thank you, Charles. We'll obviously get back to you as well. Bassam, please talk to us about how the opposition is looking at the situation, what they are able to do, what they're not able to do, and what the expectations might be. Thank you.
Thank you. The people, I'll try to describe to you how the people there inside Idlib are thinking, are perceiving the events. So not in the sense of political opposition. I have nothing, I'm not affiliated with any group of them, and they are not important in the case. It's about the people themselves in Idlib, how they are looking at it. Number one, as Charles said, that the number of displaced people in the last 2 weeks is something like 250,000, like Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio population. They just left. The school has been destroyed, the hospital has been destroyed, infrastructure has been destroyed. In other words, that these people, even whatever settlement or ceasefire, whatever we call it, they will never be able to come back to their own lands. There's nothing left for them to come back to their lands. Number two, what the people are saying or watching, that the regime is using only one single unit, which is the Tiger forces, which is very much Russian proxy forces. And in the fight, they say they are really weak. Without the Russian Air Force support, without Iranian military support, the Syrian army is not able to achieve anything. The areas that Charles described, it was easy to be taken. It doesn't have defense forces. It doesn't have people to stay out of them, even to take them 2 weeks to take it out, which shows how weak are the regime without Iran and without Russians. And the question will be here for this, again, for the people inside, is this a deal between Russia and Turkey, that Turkey will take Tel Rifat, other village was dominated by SDF or PKK forces, and Russia will take certain part? Is there a deal or there is no deal? Is Turkey is weak and couldn't stop Turkey, couldn't stop Russian? There is the incident that happens, it's literally make the people doubt about Turkish ability to be guarantors. And this is, I think, the Russians are playing and the regime is playing on these slogans to say to the Syrian in a way or other that you cannot trust Turkey. It's not the right country to protect you. You have 15 or 12 checkpoints or observation points inside that areas. Even so, it didn't stop the regime to go in. This is very big a question for Turkey to answer for the Syrian before answer to itself. How we can gain the trust with these people to tell them we will protect you. Otherwise, as Charles and all the people say, that in failing of having kind of stability, the people simply, they will run to the border, no matter what, because there's no other choices. Number three, which is very important, that the Syrian civil society and civil organization in Idlib province, still they have legitimacy, still they are strong, still they are acting to support the people in the way, even though there's no international donor support them anymore because HTS is in control, but these people are really the core point to counter the regime narrative and the terrorist narrative. They are strong. They have legitimacy more than others. Five, the HTS, they didn't fight. They just keep their heavy weapon or equipment for themselves in certain areas and leave the people alone. And again, this is sends a strong message for the people inside that no one is protecting us and everybody is using us. And here the international community with Turkey, with all other people, they should work with the civilian in order to empower them again to counter all kind of extremists. The regime and Russian, they always say that we need reconciliation, we need to reconstruct Syria, we need these people to come back, will come back. And all their behaviors every day, it goes 100% counter that messages. Today, the people where they are displaced, they didn't went back to the regime area, they went back to the more Turkish area, which by itself is send a message that the regime and Russia, they want the land without the people. So again, no matter what kind of ceasefire we will have, or no matter what settlement we'll have later on, these people will never able to come back to their own areas. That means that geographical area of Idlib is shrinking more and more, and they have more people and more people inside. The 3 million in Idlib, they used to be in 35 or 25,000 square meters, now in 15,000 square meters, which, or maybe less, kilometers, sorry, which makes their lives terrible and their humanitarian service will be terrible. People believe, again, that Turkey have an upper hand in Idlib. Russia needs Turkey, not Turkey needs Russia. And they think that Turkey position on Idlib today and yesterday and 2 weeks ago should be much more stronger, much more tougher on Russia. Astana process will never be, or Sochi will never be proceed without Turkey. Russia cannot survive in Syria without Turkey. There's no political process in Syria without Turkey. Russia cannot expand in the area without Turkey. And the people asking why Turkey doesn't have strong position from day one to block that offensive to start. Why we wait 2 weeks in order Turkey to go and talks with the Russians, with the UN, with the Americans to say how can we solve this problem. Again, there's what I'm trying to say that literally there's big chaos inside the people, psychologically, economically, politically, militarily, everything. The people just get lost. And that will be very difficult for next step, no matter how it will be the next step. There will be ceasefire or no ceasefire, whatever. There will be settlement or no settlement. I doubted the people who said that the regime will take over Idlib sooner or later. I don't see it happening. Simply the regime doesn't have the capability, financial or economic capability to feed the 3 million people, number one. Number two, this is 3 million people, they came from all over Syria running away from the regimes. They cannot accept it, the regime. It's not like Ghouta where you have 20,000 or in Daraa or other area. This area is highly condensed with the Syrian, 100% anti the regime. They can't just cross the lines and back to the regime and they say, no, we prefer to sit in the tent on the border without any support rather than come back to the regime. So the regime, to understand it or assume it or vision it, they will take back Idlib the way they took back Daraa. I don't see it happening anytime soon, not in 5 years from now. If the regime doesn't change his behavior and send the right message for the Syrian will never accept him to come back. We don't see that happening, or there's any indicator this is happening anytime soon, neither from Russia nor from the regime. This is what I have so far.
Thank you, Bassam. Jeff, please.
Yes, thank you to SETA for inviting us all here today and
Thank you.
seating me next to my colleagues, especially this young man who is always full of information and can teach us things that perhaps we can't see from our own perspective. There are certain, when one looks at Syria and the challenges that the regime faces, one can look in a micro dimension, fighting over the streets, who's up and who's down, which has its value. The avenue that I usually do and prefer is a more strategic sense of what the challenges and opportunities are. For the regime today, as before, and in a sense as always, it has two strategic imperatives. First one is to expand its sovereignty as the recognized sovereign around all of its borders. And the second challenge is one that Yasser Arafat once described as one authority and one gun. The regime, regardless of its political hue or whatever, needs to establish a monopoly of force within areas that it claims sovereignty. Those are two challenges that the regime has been facing since the outbreak of this war, and in some respects, even before that. So how is the regime progressing in that sense? We see Idlib, if you look at Idlib through that lens, you see it as one other chapter in a succession of chapters which aim at achieving these two strategic objectives. If one looks at the progression over the last 2011, last 8 years, and more specifically over the last year and a half, you see a march by the regime to establish sovereignty over its border areas and have that authority recognized by its neighbors. Surprisingly, the most advanced arena for this is the border between Israel and Syria on the Golan Heights, where we have the reconstitution of the UN UNDOF there, after it was almost obliterated in the course of the Civil War. You have Russian troops patrolling in the Golan Heights for the first time ever, in a sense having been recognized as a player, certainly by the Israelis, and less formally by the Americans. You have a general pacification of that border on both sides, notwithstanding violations that each party undertakes in the various zones of the Alpha and the Bravo zone and the no man's land zone. We have an international consensus on UNDOF, notwithstanding the American decision to recognize Israeli sovereignty over the Golan, which is a move that the Israelis themselves haven't ever asserted, but that's something else. So we have, as an example here, the ability of the regime to establish itself as the sovereign address vis-a-vis its neighbors. The least successful and the most challenging arena for this remains in the north, remains via the Turks and also with the SDF. And perhaps we could talk about that later. In terms of asserting and commanding its internal sovereignty, it's one authority, one gun. We have seen this as the central mission of the regime since day one. Regardless of whether the opposition was democratic or nonviolent or jihadi, the lens through which the regime understood these challenges was essentially the same. It was a challenge to their historical authority, to the march of the Ba'ath Party, if you will, to their monopolization of force after decades of struggle to defeat not only foreign enemies, but also internal forces, whether they be Islamic or not, who were more often than not aligned with external powers as well, and so forth. So what we see in Idlib today is, again, one more chapter of this effort by the regime to reassert its sovereign authority. Bassam is correct. It may not happen today. It may not happen tomorrow. It may not happen in 5 years. But unlike the United States, which, notwithstanding our sudden love affair for forever wars, generally has timelines that are measured in months, and generally speaking, not years when it comes to foreign adventures, the regime and its opponents are in it for the long haul, because at the end of the day, this is their country, this is their livelihood, this is the future of their own children. So they're prepared to fight according to a timetable that we don't share, that may not make sense to us, but nonetheless is a central reality of the conflict in Syria. Why don't I stop there?
Thank you, Jeff. Dr. Server, Professor.
I was asked to talk about foreign policy implications for the U.S.
Yes, the U.S. policy particularly.
That means that most of what I'm going to say is not going to be about Idlib. It's going to be about the Northeast.
Yes.
But I hasten to insert a footnote here, which is that the picture Bassam paints and Charles paint for what's happening in Idlib is in many respects a worst possible scenario for the United States, because it means that HTS, other extremists, have not a safe haven, but an unsafe haven, basically. And radicalization in those circumstances would be a normal human reaction. But let me turn towards the Northeast, because the Syria task force, this task force that the Congress mandated that USIP is running, in its interim report suggested that the Americans stay in the Northeast and do what it is needed to enable the civilians to stabilize it. the trouble is, before you can make a recommendation like that, you need to ask yourself what it would take to do it. The task force put the cart before the horse. Before they were withdrawn by President Trump, there were a total of 6 American civilians working there on contracting, rubble removal, and a few other basic necessities like demining, water, electricity. It's nowhere near the number you need to conduct a serious stabilization operation, or to prevent ISIS from returning, because what prevents ISIS from returning is having a governance and justice system decent enough to be preferred to the caliphate. As Frances Brown suggested in Monkey Cage last week, in a piece that I think has been largely ignored, but I think is very interesting, she suggested that we need much more. And my question is, how much more? And the best estimate of that I can make is from Jim Dobbins' guidelines for peacemakers. For a heavy enforcement operation, which this certainly is, in a territory with, let us say, 2.5 million people, which is about the number, maybe a little bit more than that, maybe quite a bit more than that in Idlib, maybe 2.5 million in the Northeast. What Jim suggests you need is a force of more than 35,000 internationals and 13,000 locals, costing on the order of $8 billion a year. On top of that, you'd need dozens, if not hundreds, of civilians supervising and guiding the disposition of stabilization funding. Of course, you can scamp and you can substitute some locals for some internationals, all sorts of things you can do. But look, I haven't heard anybody suggest that reconstruction, stabilization in Raqqa is going particularly well. I think it's very difficult to tell what Turkey is investing in the Olive Branch and Euphrates Shield areas of Syria. But what I've read of what they're investing suggests that Dobbins' numbers may not be far off. Frankly, the simple conclusion is that nowhere near the required resources are likely to be available for a serious American stabilization effort in northeastern Syria, even if the Gulf fees were to ante up a significant amount of funding. What about the Turks? Could they do it? Because they want a 30-kilometer buffer zone inside Syria. Could they be relied on to do the necessary stabilization, reconstruction in the whole area across their southern border? The likely answer is yes. I think something like that may actually have to happen, but not without consequences. There are more than 600,000 Kurds living in northeastern Syria. A significant percentage of them, I think, would be likely to flee, as some did from Afrin during Olive Branch. And the PKK fighters, so vital to the American effort against ISIS, would be forced back into the arms of the Syrian regime, which would no doubt expect them to do what they were created to do, which is to attack Turkey. U.S. troops remaining in northeastern Syria under those circumstances, while the Turks repress the Kurds, they think belong to the PKK, and the Syrian regime supports the same Kurds to attack Turkey, is not my idea of a place I would want U.S. troops to be. There's no real ceasefire in Idlib. It would require at least the same resources as northeastern Syria, if not more. Maybe these two scenarios lead to a standoff, because I think if the regime really went into Idlib, I suspect the Turks would take the occasion to grab northeastern Syria, or a big piece of it. And if the Turks go into northeastern Syria, I won't be surprised if the regime takes the opportunity even if it looks very difficult to try to reassert one gun in Idlib. So whatever happens, I don't think the US presence in Syria, even if doubled or quadrupled, is adequate to the task of enabling stabilization in the territory the SDF now controls, especially as ISIS reconstitutes and the Iranians decide to test our mettle. We can't get out for fear of the consequences, and we don't want to put enough effort in to make a real difference in repressing ISIS and repelling Iranian-backed proxies. It's not a good place for us to be. My recommendation would be basically this. Either you go big and fix Syria, and we can talk about what that means, or you get out and let the chips fall where they may. I admit neither is likely to happen. It's rather fitting that Hulu has seen fit to grab this moment to revive Catch-22.
All right. You're done?
Yes. Catch-22 is my bottom line.
Okay. Thank you. So, Charles, actually Bassam said, this will take a long time and it will not happen. And you talked about some sort of, methodical, incremental Russian regime approach, and it was inevitable. Can you reconcile these? Do you see a timeline, in a couple of years' time, we'll see majority of the region taken, etc. Can you paint a scenario? I know it's, it's a hypothetical, but
Sure.
In terms of when you talk about, you talked about inevitability, how do you see that playing out over the, let's say, next year?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a good question. It's a hard one. I mean, the inevitability I was pointing to is the inevitability of conflict, not necessarily of a resolution, victory on either side. I think the Russians, first of all, let's rewind a little bit in history. I mean, the Russians came up with this idea of de-escalation zones for a reason. The regime didn't have the manpower to fight on multiple fronts across the country successfully. So instead, de-escalation zones were designed, lines were drawn on the map, and the regime picked one at a time and successfully conquered 3, and Idlib is the last, the 4th. Now, with the 4th, by design, Idlib has become, as I use the horrible phrase, the dumping ground for defeated insurgents and extremists, which by design makes it the most challenging to reconquer, plus the closed border with Turkey, plus 3 million people crammed into a small space. I think despite Russia's bluster over the last few years, that in my experience, Russians do know how damn hard Idlib is going to be to conquer. It's part of the reason why they have restrained the regime for so long. But Russia has immediate security interests when it comes to northwestern Syria. The big one for them is protection of their Hmeimim air base, the cessation of these makeshift drone kamikaze attacks on the airbase from mysterious groups who have never claimed responsibility. For me, that plus the counterterrorism mission against groups like HTS and al-Qaeda loyalists are the only two reasons Russia is willing to entertain an offensive. But as we've seen with Russia, their ability to restrain the regime, all the way going back to Aleppo in 2016, has been somewhat questionable. It surprised many to know that the Russians never actually wanted to militarily conquer Aleppo city. The regime forced the issue by launching a ground offensive, and thus placing Russia in a position where it had no choice but to contribute air support in order to control the dynamics of that conflict. And we've seen that play out repeatedly. So the reason why I'm so skeptical and pessimistic here is because as I say, the cat has been let out the bag. The regime now has tasted what it tastes like to carpet bomb Idlib, which, as distasteful as it is to many of us, the regime has said it wanted to do all along. And there are some portions of the Russian side of this conflict which are equally as malicious. And the UN has shared so-called deconflicted sites all across northwestern Syria, which are mostly hospitals and schools, with all state players in Syria. And as we've seen, because it has literally been filmed, pinpoint strikes right on the top of deconflicted hospitals have been taking place over the last 4 weeks. And we also know that's not the Syrians. Only the Russians have the capacity to be launching pinpoint strikes in northwestern Syria, and they are bombing hospitals on purpose. So we shouldn't, I don't also mean to suggest that the Russians are, our reliable partner in keeping the Northwest stable. They have a mean side, which has certainly been shown. But 1 year from now, I fear Idlib will still, or portions of Idlib will still remain under opposition/jihadi control, albeit in a much more messy manner. As Bassam said, I think the regime doesn't have the manpower to hold Idlib. It doesn't. They face a serious threat from ISIS right now in the central Syrian desert, which was publicized by the regime as they decided that they could only try to contain it if they wanted to prioritize northwestern Syria. So they can't even fight on two fronts at the same time. So they can't successfully do it, but by pursuing it in this messy manner, they will only make it worse. And the last thing I'll say on this is, I made, as I said in my opening comments, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham as a jihadist actor, former al-Qaeda affiliate, the most powerful actor in that area, is deeply unpopular within the civilian population and within the vast majority of the rest of the armed opposition. Its best chance of rescuing some of the credibility that it had much earlier in the conflict when it was known as Jabhat al-Nusra was this kind of conflict. Because this is where they try to present themselves as the best defenders of the 3 million people of Idlib. And Bassam was right. For 2 weeks, they did very little. But for the subsequent 2 weeks, they've done almost everything. The big counterattack that I mentioned earlier was HTS-led. The recapture of 1 of 2 towns was HTS-led. Most of the big hard raids against the Tiger forces across enemy lines were HTS raids. This is their best chance of rescuing credibility. So if that continues, then Idlib's fate really is sealed, because then it does genuinely become HTS-istan. There's very little the international community will be able to protest against any kind of military operation there, unless it's chemical weapons or hitting hospitals, but that will still continue. And that will only make extremism and terrorism and that like more credible, more influential, and more likely to persist in the future, which is in none of our interests. But there's no easy way out of it, out of this.
Actually, Bassam, I wanted to ask you this question about unity of the opposition, whether Idlib could be one place that they can come together, but Charles addressed some of the complications and the HTS's position. How do you see that?
Look, all the Syrian from Idlib who came to DC in the last 3 years, all of them, in all sectors, they were sending the same message for the United States government. We can defeat HTS. We don't need much of your support. We just need you to keep the regime and Assad and Russia outside our borders. As long as the locals feel the fear of Russian and Assad regime, HTS will benefit, as Charles said, benefit and take over the scene and become shows like we are only defender you. The minute there's no existential threat for the people, we have relaxed for 6, 7 months, 8 months, 1 year, 2 years, with some support for civil society. I'm very emphasized on the civil society because they are more representing the 3 million Syrians we are talking about. The arms group, they, unfortunately, even they are Syrian, but very much they follow the funder. So who fund them, he guide them. It's not the people. We're our civil society, they are from the people inside. So all their requests at that time, 2 years, 3 years from till today, since Obama time till today, that please keep Russia regime outside our area, and we can take care of the HTS problem. And what happened is exactly the opposite. They stop funding the civil society. Russia is violating the de-escalating zone or de-escalating agreement that it's wrote by itself to fit its own narrative, and then they violate it every day. So I don't see how things will go on. The worst is come to worst, the scenario that Charles said, that we will have, or what we call it worst, it's like small like Gaza, where you have small group of extremists or even terrorist group like HTS. They are controlling 2 million Syrians in very small pocket, and you cannot do anything to them. No humanitarian aid, no support, you cannot communicate, and it's done. But I have to answer two things. My friends and my professors, they mentioned it. Number one, Assad approach to Israel, the Golan Heights, and all this stuff, it's for his own way to reach out to the outside world to say, guys, I'm legitimate, I can protect Israel, so support me. So in that way, he is willing to give Israelis all the guarantees, assurance the Israeli needs, just to say, I'm good guy, help me. And you can see, remember, a few weeks ago when they delivered the body of 2 soldiers, Israeli soldiers, to the Israeli, it's in the media, it was free. In reality, we don't know. At the same time, the same regime refused to release the kids and women from jail, Syrian people, because he has no, the Syrians are worthless for them, zero. For when it goes to the north, even though the regime it have the idea of one gun with one authority, but if he goes to the north, definitely he will replay the Kurds card against Turkey. He will play again the terrorist group against the West. So nobody see him legitimate. Maybe he is legitimate as a legal perspective, but he's not legitimate from the eyes of the people. Legitimacy, when you get support from the people, he doesn't have the support. He's more legal entity accepted by the international community rather than legitimacy. And back to your point that the United States can stay or leave, I think it's the Syrian, they can run their affairs by themselves in the north, all the north, in Syria. We don't need United States to come as 7 diplomats or 100 diplomats to tell us, build a school here and build roads here. We have been doing this for the last 50 years. What the people need is more stability, more some kind of agreement, political agreement among all the parties, how to go forward till the whole Syrian crisis settled. Look, for example, that the model that nobody likes, but I like it very much. The relation between Turkey and KRG is perfect. The KRG is Kurdish, Syrian are Kurdish. So why today the United States and Turkey, they focus about a strip of 5 kilometers or 30 miles or 5 miles, and they forget the whole Jazeera. Why United States and Turkey and the Syrian and the Kurds and the Muslim and the Christian in the Jazeera region, they sit together to find some formula that fit all the narratives. Syria Kurds, KRG in the sense that they are close to Turkey, friendship with the Turkey, they are part of Iraq. Syrian, that area, it could be friendly to Turkey. It represents all the components. It's not be run by the Kurds because they are maybe 20% of the whole population. But we can have stability. The area is very wealthy, very rich. The people are educated. We can run our own affairs. So it's a way to look into the issues. And that it can goes even that line to the north, to the Idlib part, or part of Idlib, that whole part of North Syria, if there's really political settlement among part of the players, Turkey, United States, the Syrian, the Kurds, the Christian, the Muslims, all together. I think we can have a model to tell Assad, we have different model, we have better model for the future. If you have stability, you have some kind of a new social contract among these people. I don't think the United States need to spend all these billions or need to keep its forces on the ground for long term.
Well, Jeff,
Yeah.
Bassam, your question sounded more like to me, but maybe we'll talk about it. Jeff, Bassam's argument, it's obviously for international recognition. My question was going to be on that, whether you can use the same model on Idlib where, there is a, let's say Turkey, right? Well,
An island of stability.
Definitely.
In a sea of unrest and conflict.
Turkey is
That's
definitely
impossible.
Turkey is obviously not interested in recognizing regime legitimacy there, and Golan Heights looks to me much less complicated. Not by maybe international law. I don't know the legal aspects of it, but in this kind of conflict where you mentioned regime is in it for the long haul. Obviously, the opposition also is there for survival. Do you see that those two coming to a clash, and then like the scenario that Charles just mentioned, they may not actually get any kind of serious victory there and then claim international legitimacy at the end?
Well, look, I think many people tend to underestimate the enduring power and attraction of the state system in that part of the world. Bassam, for example, has just suggested that somehow you can carve out a piece of northeastern Syria that will act as a model for the regime as a whole and for the state as a whole. You know, the French sort of tried that in the 20s and 30s, right? The French established a Kurdish mini-state. The French established an Alawi state. And those crumbled within years, you know, under the influence, the enduring influence of this movement after the First World War to establish states with sovereignty, with power, with this one authority, one gun. And my view is any attempt on the part of any party to suggest that reimagining that kind of undertaking is a recipe for stability, for unity, for peace, for reconstruction is blind to the past that informs or should inform our own actions.
Mm-hmm. So you're
Simple
talking
as
about you're distinguishing between regime legitimacy and state legitimacy.
Well, yeah. Even if the opposition was sitting in Damascus today, mm-hmm. they would have the same problems in the north. They'd have a problem of reconciling in some fashion with the Kurds, right? In a way that consolidated state power rather than betrayed it or undermined it. And they would also have problems with the Turks. Mm-hmm. So these, in a sense, are objective challenges, which exist regardless of the nature of the Assad regime or whatever comes in its place.
Okay. Daniel.
I agree with Bassam. The idea of not an independent state, but a part of Syria that is governed decently in the northeast is a viable idea. But to get from here to there is a very long, difficult, and expensive road. It was for Iraq's KRG. It will be for anything that happens in Syria as well, and will require a good deal of international assistance. I doubt that the Americans have anywhere near the interest in Syria to sustain that kind of effort. Obama was interested in Syria only because of ISIS, not because of Syria. Trump is interested in Syria only because of Iran, not because of Syria. So I just don't think we've got the sustainability that's required. I think the idea is a good one, but I really do doubt us. Mm-hmm. In that case, I think it's likely that Assad will very aggressively try to reassert sovereignty. And that will create not a unified, one sovereign, one gun Syria. It will create a colossal mess that will even make the war up until now look relatively tame.
Sure, Charles.
I wanted to just add to this discussion on legitimacy and the state, because I think it's a really important one, and it will become increasingly important, I imagine, in the next year or two. But I think we need to start to recognize that there's very little of a state left. The state has crumbled. Mm-hmm. If you talk about a state monopoly over power, we should be looking at the so-called heartlands of the regime in Latakia and Tartus, where a cousin of Bashar al-Assad shelled Latakia city a few months ago because he was told he couldn't assert his own authority in that area with the militias that he has established and funded over the last 8 years. A cousin of the president shelled his own city in order to send a message to his president, to his cousin, that he ought to be the authority in that city and not the state. If we look at the discussion over limited reconstruction in Syria, the state isn't funding that reconstruction. The state isn't organizing it. Syrian billionaires are being asked and tasked to do it themselves. If we look at the so-called reconstruction and rehabilitation of the electricity sector in Aleppo city since its recapture, if we look at places like Homs, the Minister of Electricity will visit the city, as he did in Aleppo a few months ago. He does a tour of all of the sites. He tells state media that things are going to be redone, and then silence. Nothing happens. There is no nationwide state anymore that the regime is able to call upon to do these things. So when we're talking about internal legitimacy, I have many friends who are longtime loyalists of the regime who say, the loyalist communities who have given husbands and sons and children and women to this conflict over the last 8 years are saying, what did we sacrifice all of that for when unemployment now is higher than during the conflict? When corruption now is worse than during the conflict? When subsidies have been removed since, in their eyes, the conflict ended? So their lives are worse now than they were in wartime. And I think that question of internal legitimacy needs to be part of this discussion. The idea that there is a central Syrian state that is going to become this international actor is, I think, frankly, I think a bit of a fantasy until they're able to become an internal state of their own.
Both Bassam and Daniel mentioned the KRG model. I just want to say, chip in if I may. Obviously, there are many different dynamics. I think one of the most important ones is KRG never fought Turkey, and PKK has never renounced violence against Turkey. It's an active, conflict, and their Syria branch is able to control, with the U.S. support, northern Syria, and there are talks between Turkey and the U.S. figuring out a way, as you mentioned, the 30-kilometer versus 13-kilometer bargaining kind of situation. But Bassam, I don't think it's a matter of these groups being able. I mean, from the Turkish perspective, it is whether it's PKK who's in charge. If they're not in charge, Kurds, Arabs actually should come, like from the Turkish perspective, and they do want stabilization being achieved through these groups. Anyway, I don't want to abuse it further.
No, but again, you cannot achieve that goal without have certain kind of dialogue. So instead of spending 2 months between the Turks and the United States about the safe zone or secure zone, depth, how important, who's be there, who's not be there, why don't we widen that scope of conversation to say, how can we make that area stable in everything, politically, militarily? What the Turkish concern is as the PKK, what the Kurdish concern, they have, again, concern from Turkey. Both concerns should be addressed. So my idea that instead of United States spending all this time and energy just to see on this 5 miles, 10 miles, 30 miles, whatever it is, and is it local forces or NATO forces, let's make it much bigger, wiser in order to achieve the long-term stability against Iran, long stability against ISIS, long stability for Turkish neighborhood to be safe, for the Kurds themselves to be, they are accepted, they are there, there's no need to have a gun to protect their own interests.
But don't forget, this negotiation started with the announcement that U.S. was going to leave and leave no troops.
Yeah, but
and they didn't want
it's very true,
immediate
but
fighting right afterwards.
we don't know till today. I don't think anybody have answered within U.S. government when the U.S. forces will leave. Maybe tomorrow, maybe in next October.
We go to Daniel's question on that. Yes, we go to the issue of whether you go in big or you pull out completely. I think that's... Anyway, we'll turn to the audience now for questions and very, very brief comments if there are comments. Please wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Dan Lieberman, you mentioned the rebuilding of Aleppo, and so I was looking up some of the information on it, and well, going back, it goes back to BBC. Well, there are some people who say Aleppo was being rebuilt, but Washington Post had an article in August of, I think, 2018, saying that Aleppo is not being rebuilt because of the sanctions against the Syrian government. So I'm wondering how much does that part play? And if the sanctions were lifted, would Aleppo then get really rebuilt?
Charles, sure.
Well, first of all, there are some articles out there saying Aleppo is being rebuilt, but if you look at the details, the only places that are being rebuilt are Western Aleppo, which was always government-held and very minimally, and if you look at the satellite imagery, barely damaged during the conflict. Eastern Aleppo has effectively been untouched. There's still no central electricity, there's still no central water, and we're talking 2.5 years since the city was recaptured. An even worse case study is Homs, which was recaptured, 4 or 5 years ago?
Right.
Still, the old city of Homs, which was the opposition area, is untouched. It's rubble. Nobody's returned. Sanctions is an important question to ask, but frankly, the regime does have the money to do limited reconstruction within areas that it chooses to do so, and it has done. If you look at its key priorities, though, as I described in the first part of my answer, the priorities for the limited amount of money they do have to reconstruct is loyalist areas. There is no prioritization, let alone any focus, to reconstruct the areas that have actually been completely destroyed. The only action that the regime has done in those areas, and you can look at East Ghouta, for example, is they've razed it. They have completely demolished what remained of Eastern Ghouta. So now it's just a wasteland. What's the plan for East Ghouta now? The regime has encouraged an alliance of Syrian billionaires to build luxury apartment buildings that will be, 200 times more expensive than any Syrian beyond millionaires who will be able to afford. So and I can tell you 15 other stories in different areas of Syria where that is the case. So I think your question needs to go back at regime intent, regime priorities. Yes, of course sanctions have an effect, of course they do. But that doesn't mean the regime is not conducting any reconstruction. It is. But look at how and why it's doing what it is doing. And I think you have an answer in terms of its intent.
Thank you. We have one here and then one there.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to Dan's comments about the only two options being stay in, get big, or get out. I think there continues to be a misunderstanding about the only policy that both President Obama and President Trump agreed upon, which was Syria. Go in for a limited purpose. President Trump has now said, let's get out because we've accomplished that purpose. Yet we continue to be blinded by these special study groups that all of a sudden are starting to invent missions that the president's never sanctioned. Keep an eye on Iran, rebuild, this, that, the other thing. So the question for you, Dan, is we are where we are, and is there a third option that just says status quo, big enough to provide a tripwire so that we at least keep some sort of normality in the current situation in northeastern Syria? Because number one, recognizing that the resources are not coming to go big, and number two, as a political tactic, nobody's going to let President Trump completely leave. So what's wrong with just keeping it the way it is? This small force tripwire provides a little bit of stability against the Turkish YPG issue, continues to show the Russians and others that the Americans are involved, and it's not costing us casualties, it's not costing us blood and treasure. What's wrong with this third option that just says stay there as a tripwire force, which may be the worst option, but the best of all those bad options?
What?
My way of thinking,
That's fine.
the use of American forces as a tripwire is an argument that defeats itself because it's only useful when somebody trips on the wire. The Marine barracks in Beirut are the answer to why I wouldn't want the Americans in that situation. The Iranians will be after them. ISIS will be after them. And, you know, they've been terrifically good about protecting themselves. They can probably continue that. But if we lose several dozen people in northeastern Syria, we'll be out of there. right away because the president isn't committed to the mission. And, I don't know, is it, why sacrifice a few dozen Americans for a non-mission? That's the question. That's how I would reply.
But his point was, I think there is a limited mission, which is to defeat ISIS with the local help, etc. So if you consider that, is it a misguided mission then, or how do you see it?
I just don't, I don't think it's sustainable. And sustainable is important.
One sentence.
Sure.
If you look at the original mandate of the counter-ISIS mission, it's not just to counter ISIS. It's also to facilitate conditions that will be amenable for a political process. And I think that answers part of this question, which is why mixing it up and staying along in the way that we are, albeit with a dwindling presence, has sustained.
But the trouble is there, Charles, that we haven't gotten even a toehold on the political process. We have been excluded, marginalized, and really defeated in the diplomacy. I have enormous respect for Jim Jeffrey, whom I spoke with not all that long ago on this dais, but I'm not seeing that the presence in northeastern Syria is helping our diplomatic clout at this point.
Okay, yes, one there.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. I would like to address this to Charles. That was phenomenal presentation you gave there at the beginning. And since you're so close to this, I want to pose the question this way. Just for someone reading the papers or Russian media, U.S. media, it's very surprising to see these terrorists being shuttled all over the area. I mean, there's criticisms of disappearing from Syria, showing up in Iraq, now over in Afghanistan, and then what you described as a dumping grounds, but it's really more whatever it is. So my question is this: people see this, or I see it anyway. It's very puzzling. So, is this puzzling? I mean, do you find this puzzling? Is there something behind this? Is there a sense to it? I mean, each single case seems to make sense. Okay, we want to get them out of Aleppo because otherwise we're going to massacre in Aleppo, so let them get on the buses and, blah, blah, blah. But overall, it seems to be moving terrorists from one place to another. And then secondly, as for puzzling things, you talk about fighting a war, fighting battles. These people have to be getting resupplied. I mean, ammunition doesn't last forever. I mean, now if you're the Russians and you have an air base and you've got these monstrous cargo planes that can fly in and unload, okay, I see where they're getting their stuff from. But now you've got this area, it's pretty well sealed off from one side, the other side. How are these people getting resupplied? Who's paying the money? Who's paying the salaries? I mean, something's going on here, I mean, is this a question mark for you, or do you actually know about all this stuff and just not going to tell us?
How long have we got? To make it short. I mean, the first part of your question, it is somewhat puzzling, how we ended up getting here, as I described it, with some of the most capable, most resistant, most determined fighters. They're all left in Idlib, plus 3 million people who, as Bassam said, are the most ardent opponents of the regime. That doesn't make them terrorists. Some of these fighters are undoubtedly terrorists. Many of them are not, and certainly the 3 million civilians are not. It was an expedient strategy for the regime in Russia and Iran to defeat the first 3 de-escalation zones and expel everyone else to Idlib. That made sense. It was the quickest, was the most efficient, the least tasteless way of accomplishing those objectives. But as I say, it has left them with the biggest, most puzzling, most dangerous challenge remaining. And the Russians are aware of that, and now frankly, they created this situation. They are going to have to find some way of resolving it. And I do think that will end up being a Russian-Turkish, some form of Russian-Turkish messy solution. In terms of your second question, well, one thing I am aware of is that in the probably years, 2 or 3 years, but earlier from here, so from 2015 and 16, I mean, the opposition and jihadist groups, I mean, they are smart enough to know that hard times were inevitably going to come at some point since Russia's intervention in late 2015. And there was a steady stockpiling of weaponry and ammunition. There are throughout Idlib cave complexes managed by and have built by, in many respects, many of the different armed groups, and there are many. And they have been storing ammunition in part in preparation for this. When there are and there have been military operations over the last few years, they have been very carefully managed in order to not suck out all of that ammunition. But there is also the angle that I mentioned, which is that Turkey, by public reporting at least, has been providing, in an apparent message to the Russians to stop, halt, has provided some level of both weaponry and ammunition to what's called the National Liberation Front. So not to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, but to the NLF, which is Turkey's main kind of proxy coalition in the northwest. So there has been some resupply. The other key thing here is that they're not actually expending huge amounts of ammunition. I mean, the opposition is being smashed. And then when they choose to do so, they launch a lightning 6-hour-long attack, and that's it. In the whole scope of things, that's not using up, cargo planes full of ammunition. I mean, on the Russian side, there's been some public reporting of this, at least on social media. You can track their cargo flights. There has been a huge Russian airlift operation in the last few weeks, directly from Russia into northern Syria to support what has been, frankly, a carpet bombing campaign. So that is of a magnitude that far outmeasures the kind of expenditure that the opposition has been forced to do. So it's kind of incomparable in scale.
I can add something. Small model of Syria. So when ISIS was in Damascus, in Yarmouk camp, so the regime officially, it was documented, the regime put them in the buses and sent them to the south of Syria, to Sweda area, with their weapons, full of their weapons. He had no problem. And funny enough, the UN was with them. So the UN was part of that movement of things. We had the same thing, I think, from Palmyra to Homs, then to Raqqa. We have another model of Jabhat al-Nusra, HTS, when they were in Daraa, south of Syria. The regime facilitated for something like 300, 400 people to go from Daraa all the way to Idlib. All this documented by their own videos. So the regime have the interest to move these people because that make him pretext later on to say, you know what, here are terrorists, let's kill them. Let's do this. But he facilitated the movement for everyone. For the weapons inside Syria, I think you can imagine it's a war zone area, it's a black market. Yeah. The regime is the main source of the weapons. Not as a regime here, I think it's more like corruption. We talk about there's no more institute. It's more about corruption. I think there's no shortage of money. And the civilian pay the price. Now, how to move outside Syria, there's a different question I have to answer.
Thank you. There was one more question here, and then one in the back.
Thank you, Kader. Karwan Zabari with the Kurdistan Regional Government. I think one of the components that we haven't talked about is the humanitarian crisis. By all accounts, and I think there's a unanimous consent here that Idlib is a ticking bomb and that Assad will at some point reassert his full sovereignty over Idlib. What does that mean for that 3 million people? Charles, you initially mentioned that Turkey has shut its border, but when it comes to that point, they're not going to go run for the sea, they're going to go run to Turkey. So any incursion or attacks by the regime or supported by Russia is a humanitarian ticking bomb. Also, a second part of my question, which piggybacks off of the general's question, is what is the real mission for the U.S. military, limited scope? Isn't that one of the components is to prevent another humanitarian crisis, that if U.S. was to pull out, Turkey incursion would mean further displacement of the people, and we at the KRG would probably see the large number of that. So Turkey would probably see the large number of humanitarian crises from Idlib attack, and then we in the KRG would see any incursion by Turkey from the northeast Syria. Can I get your take as a whole as how do you address this humanitarian crisis if this attack on Idlib is imminent? Thank you.
I don't want to hog, but I'm happy to say something.
Well, let's collect the other question while right there.
Thank you. Alan Makovsky, Center for American Progress. And this may have been addressed, and I'm an old guy, maybe I couldn't hear everything in the back, but I wanted to ask about the vulnerability of Turkish troops. First, the 12 observation posts, I mean, roughly how many actual Turkish troops as opposed to NLF/FSA are there? I know there have been a couple of troops wounded recently. How vulnerable are they? What is the interest of Russia and the ability of HTS to bleed Turkey? And maybe for Kadir, if you want to address it, how sustainable politically is it in Turkey, were Turkey to begin to take casualties? I think the question is really for Charles or Bassam. The rest of the question, other than
Yeah,
the rest.
sure.
I'll just
Anybody?
Yeah,
wants
just
talk
to answer
about-
your humanitarian issue. There is a trend with the Russian and the regime in Syria. Whenever they want to go to any area, the first thing they do, they destroy hospitals and schools. If there's local council, they destroy it. This is three major things they start with. That means they leave the people without any source of gravity to come in or to provide them any services. And then the people flee. This is exactly what's going on now in Idlib. The number is huge, disaster is huge. Till today, the people under shock, the military operation is still going on. The international community, before that crisis started, they stopped funding or fueling any humanitarian aid into Idlib because of HTS. So there was humanitarian problem, but it was in a way manageable. Today, it will not be manageable anymore. I don't think Turkey will encourage or allow the people to go to the Turkish border. Actually, in the last week, the Turkish gendarme and the Syrian pro-Turkey in Euphrates shields, they become like buffer zone between Idlib and the border. So we are talking about 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers of buffer zone by pro-Turkish forces or Syrian who are in Euphrates shields. They didn't allow the people to reach to that area. And I think this will continue later on, but that doesn't mean that there will be no humanitarian aid. The question is not about humanitarian aid in short term, it's about stability and what comes next. So if the people think that Turkey is not, this is what I start to say, if the people, local people, they don't feel Turkey existence or military forces in Syria is enough to protect them, definitely the tendency will be to go to Turkey, inside Turkey. The more Turkey show the opposite message, we are here, we have 12 observation points. Each point, I think they have 300 to 500 soldiers. It's big, it's not small. It's big base, each one.
At each point?
Each point, they have 300 to 500 soldiers, something like this. So we are talking about large number of Turkish forces around that area. But if the people, local people now, they don't feel that this is 12 observation points, it's enough to give them security to stay, the alternative definitely will go to Turkey, from Turkey go to Europe, whatever other place. The same thing when we go about the Syrian Jazeera. The people there till today, they believe that United States is there, we are safe, we are not thinking to run away or to move to KRG. But everybody knows that United States is leaving sooner or later. We don't know when or how, but they are leaving. The minute they leave, what kind of structure they leave in Jazeera? If there will be tension between Arab and Kurds or Kurds and Turkey, that means the minute that American will leave, there will be some kind of clashes. How big, we don't know. That's me, the people will leave. That's why what I'm trying to think from now, that United States should benefit from the time they are staying in Syria to create stability in the way the minute they leave, there will be minimum chances to have clashes and we have this movement.
Yes, go ahead.
Carwan's point. I just don't think the humanitarian mission is one that can be used to justify the continuing American presence. Americans are perfectly willing to spend billions of dollars on humanitarian relief and have done so.
They did so.
But I don't think they're willing to. I can't picture President Trump standing here and saying,
Look about
you
the
know,
Rukban.
I'm going to keep American troops in Syria because of the need for humanitarian relief. It's inconceivable.
Look about the Rukban. So we have the Rukban where you have TANF, American forces in the TANF, and you just, I think 10 miles away from them, you have 75,000 Syrian in the Rukban IDPs. And the American military say, we don't have the mandate of a humanitarian, we have mandate to fight ISIS. So this is not our responsibility, it's the international community, it's Damascus' responsibility, UN responsibility. We facilitate it, but it's not us. So this is just next to them out of nowhere. So just imagine other areas.
Well, because Turkey has a lot of refugees at home, obviously 3.5, close to 4 with other also Iraqi refugees. The number is much higher. But the current, obviously, priority and preference is, regime doesn't produce any new IDPs moving north. If it comes down to it, right, let's say they kept shipping away and they came too close to Turkish observation posts and they determined that they need to pull out, etc., and then basically buffer zone keeps moving north. And then you go to Euphrates Shield and Afrin, they'll send reinforcements. This is my hypothetical scenario. It's not a plan. But they'll probably send Turkish soldiers, try to reinforce and host refugees, IDPs in that area, which is not a big area, obviously. But if that doesn't work, eventually, I don't know how many years it's going to take, and there's no, solution. I don't think the border is currently shut, meaning they don't want to encourage new, refugees, obviously. But this has been the policy several years now that they want to bring humanitarian aid and everything there on the Syrian side and manage it there, not on Turkish soil, because it creates a lot of problems on the Turkish side, including political, problems along the border towns. They don't want rising more of anti-refugee feeling, etc. So, but I had a question about the U.S. Humanitarian mission, but you kind of answered that. And please, maybe you can address that as well, Jeff.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to suggest that, in fact, the momentum regarding refugees is in the other direction now. The Turks, for example, have said in the last few days that since 2000, 360,000 Syrians have moved back into Syria proper. As Kadir noted, they're essentially preventing new waves of Syrians from crossing the border. And the Kurds are complaining that, in fact, the Turks are resettling Syrians in Kurdish homes and whatever in the area that they currently occupy. In Rukban, the refugee camp, which is by all accounts a hellish place, has, over the last 3 or 4 months, I think up to 15,000 of the camp's 50,000 residents have left for Syria proper or for regime-held areas. Again, part of this Russian effort to, in certain instances, empty these camps, and if they empty Rukban, they empty an important rationale for the maintenance of the U.S. base nearby, because there's no anchor, there's no Syrian anchor left for them. So in that sense, the warnings about this disaster that's going to ensue when and if Idlib is overrun may be true, but maybe it won't be true. And it's important to recognize that many of our assumptions about what would happen in Syria have proven to be wrong. And this one may be as well.
Well, on that note, if nobody has anything to, Charles.
I did want to answer those couple of questions,
Okay,
if I can, just
go
quickly.
ahead.
I mean, on the humanitarian thing, I do think it's going to be very bad in the northwest. If things continue, escalate, deteriorate, I don't think the Turks will open the border for domestic political reasons, primarily. And then I think the Afrin and Euphrates Shield zones will come under very heavy pressure by IDP flows. And I think primarily we'll see a large swathe of territory on the Syrian side of the border become a de facto permanent IDP camp. Just the border will become an IDP camp. I mean, it already is, but it will continue. It will have to continue to grow. That's where I think Turkey will come under a lot of pressure to allow international aid organizations to expand their operations on the border, which is obviously a security issue, the bigger these IDP camps get, particularly if armed groups have been squashed into a small amount of territory. But there's going to be a lot of very significant dilemmas to consider as this thing continues. And then on the Turkish issue, I mean, I would frankly be surprised if there were 300 to 500 Turkish soldiers in each post. I haven't seen any evidence that would give me any number. Apart from looking at the resupply convoys, which tend to be 5 or 6 APCs, which might house, which might contain, if they were fully loaded with people, a total of 50 or 60 men. But I don't really think there's a great deal of per post. I just don't think we quite know yet. They're expansive by territory, but the facilities inside are pretty small. There's a few containers and a little outpost and some security posts on the outside. So they are vulnerable. They're most vulnerable to regime shelling, which has been demonstrated. They're not vulnerable to armed opposition attack, because it would be the worst thing the opposition could possibly do, would be to piss off the Turkish military. Excuse my French. But the vulnerability will increase as the situation gets worse. My biggest concern isn't necessarily that the regime will shell these posts, but ISIS has been trying to reestablish itself in Idlib for 2 years now. And HTS, ironically, has been conducting counterterrorism operations against ISIS for 2 years. They've arrested hundreds of alleged ISIS militants, including just last week, the apparent head of all of ISIS's logistics in Idlib province. My fear is that ISIS will see this as an opportunity to skew a dagger in a chaotic situation that is still somewhat held together by a design. Kill a few Turkish soldiers on a resupply convoy, throw questions at whether or not it was Iran involved or the regime or HTS or Al-Qaeda, and then the design of everything that Russia and Turkey have put together, as messy as it is, could begin to crumble. So actually, more than any, and ISIS thrives in chaos. It wants chaos. It doesn't want stability. And as bad as things are right now, as apocalyptic as they might look like on our TV screens, they could get a lot worse. And that's in ISIS's interest more than anybody else's. So my biggest fear is that.
I wasn't very well versed on this, but I did listen to one presentation at least about regime operations vis-a-vis the posts, right? Are they so far kind of, what I remember was outer perimeter.
Right. They haven't reached
rather, they haven't really.
Yeah, there was one
close.
post near Kafanabouda, which was the town that was captured and recaptured and then taken back. That was in close proximity to a Turkish post, but and that was the one that was shelled.
All right. I want to thank all my panelists for this great discussion.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Please join me in congratulating the panel.